All right, so I guess it's about time, so let's go ahead and get rolling. Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking a bit about logging, and I promise that this talk is almost entirely AI free. So I know everybody, that's the standard, you got to talk about AI. I will mention it once briefly towards the end, but that's about it. So just by way of introduction, my name is Barret Blake. I am a Microsoft MVP in the .NET and Power Automate spaces. And I'm an architect working for Nimble Pros. And you can see a bunch more stuff about me there. What we're going to delve into today is logging. So we all know that production failures are going to occur. It's inevitable. It's something that happens. And what happens after that is going to be entirely dependent on how prepared you are. If you set up your application, you've got no logging, no observability, it's going to be nearly impossible for you to figure out what's going wrong when something does go wrong. The next stage is kind of getting some scattered logs. You have some bits and pieces here. You've got a couple of items that will get recorded someplace, maybe to a flat file or written to your console or whatever it might be. But it's really hard to piece together all the parts of a modern application because modern applications have a lot of pieces. You've got your UI piece, you've got API, you've got database, you've got third-party systems that you go out and connect to and get data back. And if something goes wrong, it's really hard to tell where along that path everything has gone wrong without having a really good logging system in place. And that brings us to the third level, which is structured telemetry. So that's where we've got a clear connected story. We've got the ability to tie the various pieces of the logging together from your UI UX to the API, to the database, to the third-party systems, whatever they might be. You've got a way of connecting all that so that when you have to try and figure out what's going wrong, you have that ability to easily trace that information all the way through. And that brings us to OpenTelemetry, or OTel as it's often called. So what that is, it's an open source standard that has been developed over the last few years. It's language agnostic, it's vendor neutral, it's community driven, and excuse me. And it's really becoming the emerging standard on logging for all application systems in this modern age. Like I say, it's language agnostic is one of the key features. So you can use it with .NET, you can use it with Java, you can use it with JavaScript, you can use it with Python, whatever it might be. And there are a bunch of different places that logging can go to. There's third-party software as a service systems. There's roll your own. There's host your own system. Whatever it might be, having this OpenTelemetry standard makes it really easy if you need to make those changes and where those logs go. And OTel has four main pieces to it. So there's traces, which is the kind of like the top level. It's the part that ties everything together. So when you enter into a request, OTel will attach a trace ID to it. And it will attach that ID to every piece of logging that is associated with that request as it flows through your system. And that's the part that ties it all together, that brings it all back into a unified logging area so that you can tell this went to here, went to here, went to here, and being able to do that and follow the flow of the work as it goes through your system makes it far easier for you to figure out what's going wrong when things do go wrong. The next part of it is metrics. These are the numerical measurements. So it might be, how often an error occurs, how often an API endpoint gets called, how often a insert goes into the database, whatever it might be. It's just a way of measuring numerically what it is that's happening in your system. And the key benefit of metrics is being able to determine where to put your focus when you're looking at things like refactoring, when you're looking at things like performance improvements. If you've got a system or if you've got an API endpoint that gets called 1,000 times a second, as opposed to one that's getting called once a week, that tells you where you need to put your focus on those performance gains for the best benefit of your system. The next part of it is logs. And this is kind of like the raw data that ties everything else together. And this is the part that's, it's been part of applications almost since the beginning of application development. But the logs with OTel, they put it in a standard format with various pieces of information attached. So that it's really easy for all these disparate systems to be able to speak in a unified language and be able to help you to move from one system to another if you need to. And then the last piece is kind of an add-on. It's called baggage. And what this is a set of key value pairs that you can attach to the headers of a request as it flows through the system. So maybe you have information that isn't really critical to, for instance, an API endpoint that you're calling. So maybe you've got an endpoint that inserts an order record into your sales system. Well, the order information is critical, and that'll be part of your payload. But there may be other pieces of information that you want to keep track of. Maybe the IP address of the person that made the call, or maybe if it's a multi-tenant system, the tenant ID, that kind of thing. Those are kinds of things that would be good in baggage, and I'll talk about each of these in detail here. So let's start with traces. As I mentioned, this is kind of the piece that ties everything together. Traces are made up of units of work, which they call spans. So when you have that initial call to an endpoint, or you make that initial call in your user interface, a span is generated. So in this particular example here, in this waterfall view to the right, it's the mission.launch.initiate, and this is part of the demo that I'll show you in a little bit. But that's one span. And then you can have spans nested within those spans. So you'll have a span at the top level which tracks everything beginning to end. Then within that you'll have spans for each of the pieces of it. So you'll have a span for the UI UX, you'll have a span for the API, you'll have a span for the database. And they may be consecutive, they may be parallel, they may be nested. There's a lot of different ways that you can put spans together. And the top level of each one, excuse me, OTel will insert that in there automatically as part of the setup. But you can also generate custom spans. So maybe you have a particular function that runs 10 different pieces of work, and you want to track each of those separately. You can create individual spans for each of those pieces of work. The trace ID I mentioned is the one thing that gets kind of tied at the parent level, and it's what ties it all together. And one of the biggest benefits of traces in general is that it's what helps track that flow of work all the way through your system. So you can take what came in from the user interface and tie it to what happens in the API, and tie that to what happens in the database, and tie that to what happens in your file system, or whatever the other pieces might be. It's that trace ID that ties it all together. Metrics are the next piece, as I mentioned, and there are a couple of key pieces that metrics really help you with. One is error rate. So, a certain amount of errors are common in an application, and we all know that our support staff, if we're sending alerts to them every time that an error occurs, they're going to get fatigued really quickly. They're going to start ignoring those emails or text messages. They're going to say, oh, well, that happens every hour. We don't need to worry about that. But if you're using metrics to kind of track how often those things happen, you can set those thresholds so that something that happens once an hour, and it's a regular part of the process, and you'll get around to fixing that bug later. And that's something that you could probably safely ignore. Whereas if suddenly that once an hour bug becomes 1,000 times a second, you need to know that that's happening very quickly. So what metrics do is they allow you to define those thresholds and figure out, hey, there's suddenly an anomaly that's something that's not the usual, something that's happening that wasn't there before. You need to start looking at that immediately. The other part of metrics that are really useful is this, as I mentioned, this code usage analysis. It's saying, okay, if I've got, each developer only has a finite number of hours to put into work, and if I'm going to spend 3 weeks on a particular task, do I need to spend it on something that gets called once a month, or do I need to spend it on something that gets called 1,000 times a second? What's going to be the biggest benefit for my system? If I don't have the numerical information to be able to determine what those priorities are, then you may or may not be wasting your developer's time. So that's the other key part of metrics, is being able to figure out just how often something is being used. And it's also great for when you're launching new features and things like that. If you launch a new feature, you need to be able to know whether that's a success. Are the customers using that new feature? Is it something that interests them? Is it something that's getting engagement? Without having those metrics to be able to figure out what the level of engagement is, you're going to have a really hard time justifying continued development in that particular space. So those are a couple of the key features of metrics. I also mentioned baggage, so I'll just touch on this again briefly. This is something you can attach to the headers, and it gets passed in the headers of the request. So it's very critical that you not put any sensitive information into baggage. So obviously you wouldn't want to put in things like financial information, credit card numbers, user passwords, PII, that kind of information, because anything along that flow that can read the header of the request can read that baggage information. But it is great for things like user IDs, tenant IDs, source IP addresses, that kind of stuff. It's also fantastic for when you are doing like A/B testing and you need to track, okay, this order came in, was that customer part of our beta test, or was that customer part of the normal flow of work? And being able to evaluate the success or failure of your A/B testing, you need to have that kind of information. But you don't want to attach that information to all the in-depth data, the payload of the application itself, or the payload of the request itself. So you include that information into the headers, into the baggage. So that way you can still track it, you can still tie it to everything, because OTel will keep that information attached to the trace as it goes through everything. But it's not cluttering up the rest of your data. And then logs is the last piece of OTel, of the OpenTelemetry standard. This is the part that is the base of it's the raw data. It's the core of everything that's associated with it. Excuse me. And this is the piece that OTel provides you like right out of the box. It's all you have to do is set it up and get it working, and it'll automatically include that logging information. And it hooks into the existing logging system. So if you're working in .NET, you're probably using iLogger for your logging system. OTel just hooks into that, and you don't have to do anything else for it. And it puts it in this structured format, and we'll look at the format here in a second. But it's because it is part of that standard format, that's what makes it so that you can be vendor agnostic or vendor neutral. So if you want to use New Relic for a while and then you're not happy with them, maybe you want to switch to Datadog or maybe host your own logging system, you can easily do that with just a little bit of configuration change, because it's part of this open standard. So you don't have to rewrite your code. I've been developing a long time, and in the early days of coding, if we wanted to change the logging that was in system, we had to completely rewrite the application. Well, that's no longer the case. With OTel, you plug it in, you use that standard, and if you aren't happy with your provider, you can easily switch. And all it takes is a few minutes of configuration. And it will automatically, as I mentioned, automatically tie those trace IDs to your telemetry and to your logs. This is a look at some of the information that's included, and this isn't the complete set of data, but this is the most common ones. And most of these pieces, OTel will include automatically, like the timestamp, the trace ID, the span ID, the flags, any of that kind of information is automatically included as part of your logging, and you don't need to do anything yourself to make sure that information is included. You just have to focus on the body of the message and the attributes, the key value information that you want to keep track as part of that logging information. So let's talk a little bit about best practices. Excuse me. So logging is something that you have to use the right level in the right place. So, obviously when you're doing your development locally, you want to keep track of absolutely everything. So you'll set it, down up all the way up to the trace level. That will make sure that every single log that gets triggered gets recorded. And that way you have that information for your development efforts. But obviously when you ship that to, or when you publish that into a deployed format, whether it be a UAT system or production, you don't want all that logging information, especially if you're using, for instance, a SaaS service for your logging, because they charge you by volume, and it can get very expensive very quickly. I've worked with a couple clients that use things like Datadog and New Relic, and when they've got systems turned all the way up, it gets really expensive really fast. So you always want to make sure that you're choosing the right level of logging for the system or for the area that you're working in. So typically in production you would just start with warning. So it gets warnings, errors, and critical messages. But there may be times when you need to get a little bit more information. So you set it at the info level as well, and you track that maybe for a couple hours or a couple of days to get that information. But you always want to make sure that you're monitoring that very carefully so that you're not cluttering up the system with things that you don't need. But that's also key on the other end of it. So when you're doing the development work, you need to make sure that when you're creating these log messages, that you're using the right information or the right level for that log. If something is a warning, you don't want to log it as an error. If something is informational, for instance, maybe you want to record the attributes that were passed in or the parameters that were passed into a function. That's great for your local development, but most of the time in production, you're probably not going to want most of that information. So you need to make sure that when you're creating those log records, you're setting the right level so that when you're setting the system in production, that it's tracking the right information as well. Some common anti-patterns for people, especially when you're first figuring out how to do logging. One of the things that I mentioned is people have a tendency to overlog everything. So make everything a debug message. Track it all, make sure it's all recorded. You need to make sure that you're only logging that which you actually are going to need. If you're logging, hey, this function started, this function got to this step, this function got to this step, this function got to that step. Well, that's fine as long as you set it at the right level, as a debug level or something like that, so that you have it there when you're doing your development, but you don't want that anywhere else. So just make sure that you're not overlogging and including things that you really aren't going to need. When you write that log or when you create that log event, ask yourself the question, what would this help me solve if something goes wrong? Do I actually need this information to solve the problem? The next thing is unstructured messages. Make sure that the message that you're passing in is clear but concise, and that it includes the relevant information. You also want to make sure that you're not using string concatenation. And it's a habit for some people to put everything into the string message itself, string concatenate it, and just call that the message. What you want to do with OTel instead is to put attributes into your message and pass those attributes in as a separate parameter to your log. And what that does is it makes it so these OTel systems or systems that support it turns those into queryable attributes. Whereas if you're just string concatenation and you're sticking it in the message itself, then you end up getting just these strings that you're going to have to do a string search for, and it makes it much more difficult to find relevant information. Whereas if you're passing it as a parameter, you can very easily query in most of the systems that you'll be working with. The next piece is missing context. So make sure that you are including those pieces of information that you're going to need. It's a tendency for some of us to just write a message that says like operation failed, like it says there. Well, that doesn't tell you what failed. It doesn't tell you what information was part of that failure. It doesn't tell you why it failed. So make sure that when you're creating those log messages that you're including the context that you're going to need. Again, ask yourself the question, what information do I need to use this log record to solve a problem? And if there's something that's missing, make sure you add it. If there's something that's there that's extraneous, make sure you remove it. And I mentioned before with the fatigue loops, again, using metrics helps you to solve that problem so that you're not sending alerts on every issue, but you're only sending those alerts when you actually need to send an alert. So as far as getting started, the examples that I have here are from .NET because that's my background, that's what I work with. But it's pretty much the exact same setup in just about every language that you're going to be working with. So for most setups, OTel is going to have one or two libraries that are the core. And one of them, in this particular example, is the OpenTelemetry.extensions.hosting library. And what that is, that's the core OTel system. You attach that, and that's what OTel is. For some systems, there's going to be an additional library or package that's kind of context sensitive that ties it to what you're working with. And for this example here, I've got the instrumentation.ASP.net core. That is the part that tells it what system it's working with, and it may or may not be needed for depending on what you're working with. And then the last part, and so the second or the third library, is the exporter. So you need to be able to take those log records and send them somewhere. Now, whether you're sending it to the console, whether you're sending it to App Insights, whether you're sending it to Grafana or Datadog or wherever it is that you're sending that information, there's going to be a relevant exporter that you install that is part of that. And that's really all you need, for getting that trace information, for getting those basic spans, for getting those log records. Really all you have to do in almost every one of these libraries is just install the 1 or 2 packages, do a couple lines of configuration, and you're good to go. Everything else is kind of automatic and just works for you. As far as where you're setting the information, there are a lot of options, and you can see those here. You can do self-hosted. There's like Jaeger and Grafana and Elastic Stack for that. Are some of the three most common ones. There's commercial products like Datadog, Grafana Cloud, App Insights, New Relic. Again, those are the most common ones. The basic trade-off is where you're spending your money for those two. Are you spending that money on your own infrastructure, on your own support staff, on your own people and development efforts, or are you spending that money on the service and then they handle all of that for you? So the cost, most of the time, it's probably going to be pretty close to the same either direction that you go. It just depends on your particular setup and process. And like I say, it's just a question of where you're sending that money and where you're spending it. Do you want the ease for the cost, or do you want to do it yourself? And of course, if you want, you can roll your own. You could write your own front end. If you just want to take those log records, send them all to a database somewhere and write your own front end to do it, you could do that too. I wouldn't, but you could. And that's the biggest advantage of OTel, is because it's the standard, because it's a set way of doing it. All these providers, all you have to do to switch from one to the other is just change a couple lines of configuration. Maybe you have to swap out the exporter library. That's about it. You don't have to rewrite your application to do that. So for those of you who are familiar with .NET, one of the things that I love is Aspire. It includes this OTel support right out of the box, and that's what the demo that I'm going to be doing today is based on that. But again, it works pretty much the same way regardless of what you're using. And one of the things that Aspire includes is this service defaults library project that allows you to set up some of this universal telemetry stuff that can be used across all of your applications. And again, that's one of the things that I love about Aspire. So, all right, let's jump over to the demo here. All right. So actually, let me, there it is. All right, so I've got this Aspire application I've got running here. So what Aspire gives you out of the box is this dashboard that you use with your local development efforts, and it gives you the access to these various pieces of telemetry. So you've got the raw console logs here. So you can see I've got this is basically the raw logs, trace information's coming out. It also has it in a structured format where those logs are tied to the trace ID. I haven't actually done anything in the application yet, so there's no trace IDs that are visible yet. And then there's traces where you can look at that waterfall view and follow the flow of information through an application. And it's got metrics. So one of the things that Aspire gives you is a bunch of metrics right out of the box. And again, these are all set up through OpenTelemetry. But you have the ability to add your own metrics to that as well. So for instance, this is all a bunch of stuff that's tied to your local Kestrel system as you're running your application. And you can see the requests that are going through and the things that are coming out of .NET out of the box here. So let's go ahead and look at the application itself. And what I've got here is this dashboard of just let me shrink that just a little bit. Is that too small maybe? Just screen that up a little bit. It's just this simple dashboard to demonstrate some of these concepts. I've got my 5 space Star Trek crews here, and I can send them on missions. Say if I want to send Captain Kirk on a high priority mission from the Enterprise, I can click Launch Mission. And what you'll see down here is some login information that's tied to that. And it's doing some random number generation here, just changing these fuel level, shield strength, warp core temperature, just randomly every few seconds. And it's creating log records for all these. And these pieces here are metrics. You can see baggage. So for instance, if I click on this one and look at the baggage, you can see that it attached these two headers that came from these two parameters. And then of course you can see the actual raw logs here. So if I jump back over here to my dashboard, you can see these logs coming in real time here. And it's basically giving you all this raw information here. And then I can go to the structured, and you can see now that's tied to traces. So if I click on the trace here, so you can see this information that's coming across. And it's a waterfall display for each of these. So you can see these are the various spans that are just being displayed here. And that just keeps adding, because that's the real-time one that's doing the updates here. If I go back over here, actually let me go back over here and do this generate load button here. And what that'll do is launch all the other 4 missions, which gives a little bit more information. So you can see that I've got 2 of these missions that failed. And if I come back over here to my logs, if I find one of those, there we go, and look at the trace for that one. So you can see it started with this on-click event. You can see the mission launch initiated. And one of the great things about this is with this telemetry that's giving you with these traces, and especially with this waterfall displays, you can see the time span for each of those in a visual format. So you can tell really easily and very quickly, hey, this piece is taken, see what took 4.29 seconds for the entire thing beginning to end. And you can look at the individual segments of that and say, okay, this piece here of it is something that's taking by far the longest each time that it gets called. And you can look at these examples and see very quickly, very visually, where you want to put your focus. So, again, I go back to that point of, if you've only got a certain amount of time to put your development efforts in, where do you want to put that effort? Do you want to spend it on something that takes 10 seconds and try to get that down to 3 seconds? Or do you want to spend it on something that takes 0.2 seconds and you want to try to get down to 0.1 second? That's not always that easy to determine and tell when you're looking at that information. But this gives you the visual record and the visual display to be able to very quickly and easily set those priorities. And then metrics here. So I mentioned some of those, but let me demonstrate some of those here. There we go. There's the custom ones that are created for this. So you can see this is the number of active missions. You can see I've got 3 active missions right now. You can see like the fuel level in real time, and there are different types of metrics, and I'll walk through those here in just a second as we look at the source code. You can tell how long the launch took. The number of successful launches was 3. The number of total launches was 5, and so on and so forth. So again, it gives you this, the metrics give you this visual information, gives you this numerical information. So again, you can tell where you need to put your focus on your development efforts, your debugging efforts. Excuse me. Okay, so let's look at the source code just real quickly here. And again, in Aspire, it's a lot of this is built in as part of the default application. And they give you this service defaults project where a lot of this is ready for you out of the box. I've added a couple things for this one. For instance, as I mentioned, metrics are not something that it gives you out of the box except for some of the built-in .NET Core stuff. But you can very easily add various types of metrics yourself. And you do a little bit of configuration here. So I've got this part here, which sets up the OpenTelemetry itself. I've got this part here, which configures the metrics piece of it, saying, okay, I'm going to have some metrics. I tie it into this application set. Here's the piece that gives you the tracing information. But one of the key things here is the exporter part. So for this is the piece of configuration that's telling it, I want to send this information back to my Aspire dashboard. But when you go to production, Aspire is not something where you deploy the dashboard to production. You want to use some other service, whether it's Grafana or New Relic or whatever it might be. And really all you have to do is to just change a couple of lines of configuration. So in this particular case, if I was going to send it to App Insights instead of my Aspire dashboard, all I have to do is add one more library here, which is the Azure Monitor OpenTelemetry ASP.NET Core package, and then add this piece of configuration. And that's it. So if you want to change where your logging information is going, it's very simple, very quick, very easy. You just change a little bit of configuration most of the time. Sometimes you'll have to change a library, but for most of it, you won't need to. And that's all you have to do to get it deployed. Looking at the actual code itself here, so I've got this library here, or this service in my code that's setting up the various pieces in .NET. Now sometimes in .NET it gives it a little bit of different names than the standards. So for instance, it's using meter instead of metric, activity source instead of trace, that kind of thing. But you get used to that as you're working with things. There are a number of different types of metrics. So for instance, there's counter, that's just one that the auto increments each time you call it. There's up-down counter, which lets you decrement it as well as increment it. And then there's a couple of different ones that give you the ability to track information over time. One of them's histogram, and that's kind of like that one spike measurement. And then there are the observable gauge. So the observable gauge is like this one here. So it gives you this gauge information to be able to track that information over time. So, excuse me. All right. I go back over here. So, I don't want to word this. Actually, before I go on to the next thing, again, just kind of highlighting how this stuff gets put into the application. So you've got your traces here. It's very simple to include that, metrics, logs, and baggage. And the other thing I was going to cover is spans. So I mentioned before that you have the ability to create custom spans. So it can be very useful for breaking up the various steps into, or breaking up a longer package into smaller steps. So just like if you were going to go through and do some refactoring, you might want to be able to track information separately as well. So let me show you an example of that in here in my mission service. So I've got this launch mission async function, and that's the part, when I click the launch button, it calls that endpoint, or calls that API, and gets this service, so I can pass in, my baggage, which is, the two header pieces, the commander or the priority and the priority. I've got my launch counter, so here I'm calling the metric and adding one piece to it. Zoom that in just a little bit. Let's see here. And then I've got span. So you have the parent span, which is like the top level one that's automatically there. So what you can do is you can get a reference to that if you want to add additional information to it. So in this particular case, it's adding a number of tags to that span. So like the mission ID, the name, the destination, crew count, that kind of stuff. So you can add additional information to this parent span as it's going through and getting generated. Add event is the metrics. If you need to call those metrics individually. So in this particular case, it's calling that parent span, saying, okay, trigger a metric on that parent span of launch initiated, and attach the information that's tied to that. And then here's the actual log information record that's being written out to the logs, and you can see it's writing those two pieces, and that's the part that we've always done as developers, is including that information. Here it's randomly determining whether or not a mission should be triggered as a failure, so it can keep tracking, just doing some random information generation here. And then if you want to create your own span, you can do something like this. So you can say, okay, go in here and give me a new activity. Again, .NET, for some reason, they rename things. So they don't call them spans, they call them activities in .NET. So saying, okay, create a new span out of my telemetry, and and do some information, pass some information in there. And if you put it, for instance, in a using block, that'll automatically end the span. You can also close the span manually yourself if you want to. Again, here it's creating a second span with the validation here, another span for crew boarding. So you can see as you go through here, you can find different ways of tracking that information to make your debugging efforts when you come back over here a whole lot easier. So, you know, if I go back and look at the traces and scroll way up here because it keeps running and adding that information. There we go. So you can see, you know, the launch initiated is the automatic span, and then there's these individual spans that we've created manually ourselves. The pre-flight check, the fuel validation, the crew boarding, systems initialization, all that kind of stuff. So those are the pieces that we've added manually ourselves, and then we've got this up here, which is automatically generated by OTel. So you know, how much you track, how much you log, how much you break it down is really up to you, and it's a matter of just determining for yourself what are you going to find useful. If something starts to go wrong, you know, what do I need? What information do I need to figure out what's going wrong and why? And then if you need to get that information back, if you need to see it, so for instance here, whoops, where is it? There we go. So here, you know, you do have access to get back into that information to see it. So if I look at, you know, here I can see the activities that are tied to that. And I can see the live telemetry. That's actually coming back out of OTel, and you can get a reference to that to be able to display that. So if you want to create some kind of user interface to be able to see that information visually outside of, you know, whatever your logging system is, you can do that as well and get access to that. All right, so let me go back over here for just a couple last slides. So, you know, the stack in action here, the key part here, or the key part here is what happens at step 3. You know, do you have that information that you're going to need when something goes wrong? You know, have you created enough logging? Have you created the right kind of logging? And have you set it up so that you can easily figure out the various steps and follow that workflow all the way through the system, so that when there is an error, you can kind of backtrace it and figure out, okay, is this a data issue? Is this a logic issue? Is this a business rules issue? Whatever it might be. By having that information that's tied together with the trace, it's a lot easier for you to figure those pieces out and to be able to identify, you know, step 4, figure out what the root cause is and fix it. You know, obviously, if you don't have that information, you can still figure out what's going wrong and fix it. But if you've got the right login information, you know, those last 3 steps are a lot quicker, and you can respond to issues a lot faster. So just, you know, a couple key takeaways here. So one, this is the emerging standard. This is kind of what just about everybody is going to. Just because it is a community standard, because it is vendor neutral and vendor agnostic or language agnostic. So you can use it pretty much anywhere. You know, so a lot of times, you know, most of us are working with applications that are varied. You know, we might have a .NET backend API. We might have a you know, a Redis database. We might have a you know, a SQL Server database. Second thing, we might have you know, AWS cloud storage for our file storage. We might have an Angular application on the front end. You know, we work with these systems that are so disparate and have so many different pieces that are kind of unrelated to one another language-wise. It makes it a lot more difficult to tie those pieces together with our logging if we don't have something like OTel to help us to put it all into a unified standard and be able to tie all that information so we know, you know, this is what happened in my Angular app, this is what happened in my .NET app API, this is what happened in my SQL Server database. You know, it makes our lives a whole lot easier as developers. The other things, so making sure that we've got our discipline as far as what we're logging, how much we're logging, and what level we're logging at. Baggage, use that wisely. There are times when it's great to use baggage, but there are things that it's definitely not for. It's definitely not for any kind of sensitive information. And again, it gives you the freedom to switch platforms. If you're using one service and you're not happy with it, 10 minutes and you're on another service. And that's all there is to it. That's what it is. Thank you, everybody. So the slides and the demo application will be out of my GitHub repo, and I'll get that posted in the Discord channel here probably tonight sometime. Does anybody have any questions? I know I kind of ran through a lot of here things. 45 minutes is a very short amount of time. So. All right. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.